The early morning sun cast a golden glow over the quiet suburban neighborhood as James Calloway stepped onto his backyard deck, coffee in one hand, a folded American flag in the other. The air was crisp, carrying with it the faint rustling of leaves, the kind of morning that reminded him of the dawn patrols he had once led through foreign lands. He walked with steady purpose toward the tall aluminum flagpole he had installed just a week prior, its base firmly cemented into the ground, a testament to his resolve. Every morning, this was his ritual. He would stand before the pole, take a deep breath, and run his fingers over the stars and stripes before hoisting the flag high into the sky, watching it catch the breeze and dance against the backdrop of his modest home. To James, this wasn't just a morning routine. It was an act of remembrance, a tribute to the men he had served with, some of whom had never come home. It was for them, for the brothers in arms who had given everything, that he saluted as the flag reached its peak. He stood there for a long moment, eyes locked on the red, white, and blue, whispering a quiet, private prayer. But as peaceful as the moment was, it was shattered just a few hours later by a sharp knock at his front door. James opened it to find a man in his mid-40s, wearing a crisp polo shirt embroidered with a homeowners association logo and khaki slacks that looked as if they had never seen a day of hard labor. The man held a clipboard and wore a carefully practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Calloway, good morning," the man began, his tone overly cordial. "My name is Alan Greaves, and I'm with the HOA. We need to talk about the structure in your backyard." James sighed, already sensing where this was going. "You mean my flagpole?" he said flatly. "That's the one," Alan replied, flipping through his paperwork. "You see, according to the HOA guidelines, structures over 10 feet require prior approval from the board, and unfortunately, we don't have any record of a request from you." James crossed his arms, his stance firm. "I didn't think honoring my country required permission," he said, his voice steady but laced with irritation. Alan chuckled lightly, but there was no warmth in it. "Look, Mr. Calloway, it's not about patriotism. It's about maintaining the aesthetic integrity of the neighborhood. Some homeowners feel that the flagpole is a bit excessive." James felt a slow burn of anger creeping up his spine. "Excessive," he echoed, his voice laced with disbelief. "It's a flagpole, not a casino sign." Alan shrugged, unfazed. "Rules are rules, Mr. Calloway. We have to be consistent in enforcing them." He extended a crisp, printed letter. "This is your official notice. You have 7 days to remove the flagpole, or we'll begin issuing fines, $50 per day, until compliance is met." James took the paper, but didn't glance at it. Instead, he stared at Alan, his blue-gray eyes unwavering. "And what if I don't take it down?" he asked. Alan sighed, as if dealing with a stubborn child. "Then, Mr. Calloway, we'll be forced to take legal action." "We'd rather not go that route." James studied the man in front of him, seeing nothing but bureaucracy where there should have been respect. He inhaled slowly, controlled his temper, and then spoke with quiet steel in his voice. "I'm not taking it down." Alan's lips pressed into a thin line. "Then I suppose we'll see you in court," he said before turning on his heel and walking away. That evening, James sat on his porch, turning the HOA notice over in his hands while his longtime friend and fellow veteran, Frank, sat beside him. "Unbelievable," Frank muttered, shaking his head. "You fight for this country, risk your life for that flag, and now they're fining you for flying it?" James exhaled slowly. "It's not about the money," he said. "It's about principle. It's about honor." Frank leaned forward, his expression dark. "You know what this is, right? It's not just about the flagpole. They don't like people like us, veterans, old-timers, people who stand for something. The HOA thinks they can push you around because they've done it before." James narrowed his eyes. Well, they picked the wrong man this time. The next morning, James found another letter taped to his door. This time, the fines had already begun. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. Some residents stood by James, shaking his hand in solidarity. Others avoided eye contact, mumbling about rules being rules. A younger couple new to the community even went so far as to email the HOA, complaining that James was setting a dangerous precedent. One line in their email made his blood boil. If we didn't get away with this, what's next? People parking tanks in their driveways. That night, as James sat in his living room, frustration mounting, he made a decision. He grabbed his phone, walked outside, and recorded a short video. My name is James Calloway. I served this country for 26 years. I lost friends, men better than me, who never got to see home again. This flagpole is for them. And now the HOA wants me to take it down because they say it disrupts the look of the neighborhood. I won't do it. I won't erase my brother's sacrifice because of a fine. If you believe that honoring our veterans should never be a crime, share this. He uploaded the video, not expecting much. But by morning, everything had changed. The video had exploded. Hundreds of thousands of views. Comments flooded in, fellow veterans, active duty soldiers, civilians alike, all outraged by the HOA's actions. News outlets began calling, eager for an interview. It wasn't just a neighborhood dispute anymore. It was a national conversation. James had unknowingly ignited something bigger than himself. The HOA had picked a fight, but they hadn't realized who they were dealing with. Because James Calloway wasn't just a homeowner. He was a Marine, and he wasn't backing down. James Calloway had spent decades standing his ground on battlefields far from home, facing enemies with far more firepower than a suburban HOA. But as he sat at his kitchen table, watching his phone screen flood with notifications, he realized he was stepping into a different kind of war. The video he had posted less than 24 hours ago had already amassed 500,000 views, with comments pouring in from people all over the country. Some were fellow veterans, outraged at the idea of a man who had served his country being fined for flying the flag he had bled for. Others were civilians who saw the battle for what it was, a petty HOA overstepping its bounds to exert control over a man who had earned his right to honor his comrades however he saw fit. And then there were the reporters. News outlets from across the country were reaching out, eager to hear his side of the story, ready to turn his quiet fight into a national headline. James wasn't one for media attention. He had spent most of his life avoiding the spotlight, but this was bigger than him now. This wasn't just about his flagpole. This was about respect, about principle, about how easily people in power could use rules and regulations to trample over the rights of the very people who had fought to defend them. As James scrolled through the messages, one name caught his eye, a journalist named Rebecca Hayes from a major news network. Unlike the others, her message wasn't just a request for an interview. It was a warning. Mr. Calloway, I've been investigating HOA corruption for a long time, and I think what's happening to you is just the tip of the iceberg. If you're willing to talk, I'd like to meet. James exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. He had suspected from the beginning that the HOA's fight against him wasn't just about a flagpole, but this confirmed it. There was something deeper at play. That evening, he met Rebecca at a small coffee shop just outside the neighborhood, choosing a quiet booth in the corner. She was younger than he expected, maybe in her mid-30s, but her eyes carried the weight of someone who had seen too much. She slid a thick manila folder across the table. Your HOA has a pattern, she said, keeping her voice low. They don't just enforce rules, they enforce them selectively. And almost every case I've found has targeted the same kinds of people. Older homeowners, veterans, people who have lived in the neighborhood long enough to remember when it wasn't run like a dictatorship. James flipped open the folder, scanning the pages. Case after case detailed fines, legal battles, even forced evictions. A retired firefighter had been fined into foreclosure over a mailbox that was an inch too tall. A widow had lost her home after the HOA drained her savings with relentless fees for landscaping violations. And the common thread in all of them, they were all long-term homeowners. People who had no intention of leaving. People who still believed that a neighborhood was supposed to be a community, not a corporation. James clenched his jaw. "They're forcing people out," he muttered. Rebecca nodded. "They're running a scam, Mr. Calloway. The HOA president, Alan Greaves, he's been using these fines to push out older homeowners and then selling their properties to developers for a profit. And if you look at the numbers, it's working. In the last 5 years, nearly 30% of the homes here have changed hands." James sat back, gripping the edge of the table. He had known the HOA was corrupt, but this was bigger than he had imagined. This wasn't about a flagpole. It was about power, money, and control. "So they came after me," he said, more to himself than to her, "because they thought I'd be easy to break." Rebecca gave him a small, knowing smile. "They made a mistake," she said. "You're not the type to break, Mr. Calloway. And now you've got the entire country watching." James left the coffee shop that night with a new sense of purpose. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It was a fight for every homeowner who had been bullied, every veteran who had been disrespected, every person who had been forced out of their home because an HOA saw them as an inconvenience. When he got home, he found another letter taped to his door. The fines had doubled, and this time there was a threat. If he didn't remove the flagpole by the end of the week, they would take legal action. James tore the letter in half. "Let them try," he muttered under his breath. The next morning, he called Rebecca. "Set up the interview," he told her. "Let's show the world what's really going on here." The interview aired that night, and within hours, everything changed. News stations across the country picked up the story, framing it as a battle between a veteran and a power-hungry HOA. Social media exploded with outrage. Support poured in from veterans organizations, legal defense groups, and even politicians. But more importantly, people within the neighborhood started speaking up. Homeowners who had been too afraid to go against the HOA now saw a chance to fight back. They came to James, sharing their own stories, revealing how they too had been targeted with bogus fines and threats of foreclosure. A group of them decided to form a coalition, a resistance within the neighborhood, demanding transparency, demanding justice. But the HOA wasn't about to back down. The very next day, James received an official summons. Alan Greaves and the HOA were suing him. The charge: public nuisance and defamation. They claimed that his refusal to comply with community rules was damaging property values, and that his public accusations were spreading false information that harmed the HOA's reputation. James let out a humorless laugh as he read the papers. "They're scared," Frank said, sitting across from him at the kitchen table. "They're trying to shut you up before this gets any bigger." James nodded, setting the papers down. "Then we make it bigger," he said. He wasn't just going to fight this lawsuit. He was going to expose every corrupt, underhanded thing the HOA had been doing. They had declared war on him, and they thought a few fines and legal threats would make him surrender. But they didn't understand who they were up against. He had fought for his country, and now he was going to fight for his home. And he wasn't doing it alone. The battle had only just begun. The summons sat on James Calloway's kitchen table like a landmine waiting to go off. The official wording, public nuisance and defamation, was almost laughable, but the implications were not. The HOA wasn't just fining him anymore. They were suing him in an attempt to silence him, to crush his resistance before it spread too far. But James wasn't the kind of man who backed down. He had faced down enemy fire, survived war zones, and watched friends give their lives for something greater than themselves. He had fought for his country. He had fought for his brothers. And now he was going to fight for his home. Frank sat across from him, arms crossed, his old Marine Corps cap resting on the table. "They're scared," he said, nodding toward the papers. "They know they've lost control of the narrative, so they're trying to shut you up in court." James exhaled slowly, his fingers drumming against the table. "Let them try," he muttered. They picked the wrong fight. But despite his confidence, he knew he needed help. This wasn't a battlefield, it was a courtroom, and that was a war fought with different weapons. The next morning, James reached out to a lawyer recommended by Rebecca, a man named Thomas Grayson, a former JAG officer who had spent years defending veterans in legal battles just like this. When Thomas arrived at James's house, he wasted no time. "I've seen cases like this before," he said, flipping through the paperwork. HOAs thrive on intimidation. They don't expect people to fight back. James smirked. "Then they're in for a surprise." Thomas nodded. "That they are. But before we go into court, I need to know everything. Have they threatened you directly? Tampered with your property?" James hesitated, then frowned. "Not directly, but..." He stood up, walked to the back door, and gestured toward the flagpole. "A few nights ago, I heard someone out there. I went outside, but they were already gone. The next morning, I found the base of the pole scratched up, like someone was trying to loosen it." Thomas's jaw tightened. "That's harassment. And if we can prove they were behind it, it'll make our case even stronger." He leaned forward. "James, this case isn't just about you anymore. It's about every homeowner they've bullied, every veteran they've disrespected. If we win, we don't just get your flagpole back, we expose everything they've been doing. But to do that, we need proof." James exhaled, running a hand through his graying hair. "How do we get that?" Thomas gave him a small, knowing smile. "We make them slip up. We put pressure on them, the same way they've been pressuring you." That night, James recorded another video. He stood in front of his flagpole, his face illuminated by the porch light. "The HOA isn't just fining me. They aren't just suing me. They've been harassing me, trying to scare me into backing down. But I won't. Because this isn't just about a flagpole, it's about the kind of country we want to live in. A country where people stand up for what's right, no matter the cost." The video went viral overnight. By morning, news crews were parked outside his house, veterans organizations were calling to offer legal support, and neighbors, many of whom had been too afraid to speak out, were finally coming forward with their own horror stories. And then something unexpected happened. An anonymous envelope arrived in James's mailbox. No return address, no name, just a thick stack of documents. James sat down with Thomas and Rebecca to go through them, his hands slightly trembling as he flipped through the pages. The documents weren't just HOA meeting notes or financial statements. They were receipts, transactions, and internal emails exposing a level of corruption far worse than they had imagined. The HOA president, Alan Greaves, hadn't just been selectively enforcing rules. He had been running a full-scale operation, targeting elderly homeowners, hitting them with impossible fines, then forcing them into foreclosure. And once they were gone, he had been selling their properties at marked-up prices to a real estate company. A real estate company owned by his own family. Thomas let out a low whistle. "This is fraud," he said, flipping through the pages. "It's not just unethical, it's illegal." Rebecca's eyes widened as she pulled out another document. "And it gets worse," she whispered. "Look at this." She turned the paper toward them. It was an internal email from Alan Greaves himself, sent months before James's flagpole battle had even begun. The subject line, "Find a way to get Calloway out." James felt his blood run cold. They were targeting me before this even started? Rebecca nodded grimly. They knew you wouldn't comply easily. They wanted you gone because they saw you as a threat. The flagpole was just an excuse. James leaned back in his chair, his fists clenched. He had suspected there was corruption, but this was personal. They hadn't just come after him, they had planned it. They had wanted him out from the beginning. And now they had left behind the evidence to prove it. Thomas set the papers down, his expression serious. "We're not just fighting a lawsuit anymore," he said. "We're exposing a criminal operation." James stood up, his spine straight, his jaw set. "Then let's expose them." The next morning, they went public with the documents. They held a press conference right in James's front yard, surrounded by neighbors, supporters, and cameras. Rebecca stood beside him, holding up the evidence for the world to see. Thomas laid out the legal implications, explaining how the HOA had been preying on homeowners for years. And then James spoke. "For months, they've tried to intimidate me. They fined me, they sued me, they even tried to sabotage my property. And I stood my ground because I believed this was just about my right to fly a flag. But now we know the truth. This was never about a flagpole. This was about power. This was about greed. And this was about them thinking they could push around a wrong man." The press conference aired nationwide. Within hours, the backlash against the HOA was overwhelming. The local government announced an investigation. State officials got involved. And as the pressure mounted, Alan Greaves disappeared, leaving behind a crumbling empire built on lies. But James knew the fight wasn't over yet, because there was still a courtroom battle ahead. And this time, he wasn't just fighting for his flagpole. He was fighting to bring the whole corrupt system down. And he wasn't going to lose. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled, with news cameras stationed just outside the doors. James Calloway sat at the defendant's table, his hands folded in front of him, his expression unreadable. The fight had escalated beyond anything he had imagined when he first planted that flagpole in his backyard. What had started as a petty HOA dispute had turned into a national scandal, exposing corruption, fraud, and targeted harassment within the homeowners association. The evidence they had uncovered had forced state authorities to launch an investigation, and now the once powerful HOA was scrambling to contain the fallout. Alan Greaves, the HOA president who had orchestrated the entire scheme, was nowhere to be found. He had resigned days earlier citing health concerns, but everyone knew the truth. He was running, trying to get out before the full weight of the law came crashing down on him. But even without Greaves, the HOA wasn't backing down. They had brought in a high-powered legal team, determined to make an example of James, hoping that even in defeat, they could salvage their reputation. Thomas Grayson, James's attorney, adjusted his tie and leaned in. "They're going to paint you as a troublemaker," he murmured. "They'll try to argue that you're the one who turned this into a media circus." James smirked. "Let them try," he muttered. "I didn't expose them. They exposed themselves." The judge entered the courtroom, and the trial began. The HOA's lawyers wasted no time. They presented their case with polished precision, arguing that James's refusal to comply with the community's bylaws had caused undue distress to the neighborhood, that his defamatory public statements had tarnished the HOA's reputation, and that his continued resistance had led to public disorder. James sat through it all unmoved. He had seen men lie before. He had heard the polished words of bureaucrats and politicians who thought they could manipulate the truth to suit their agenda. But truth, he had learned long ago, had a way of cutting through the noise. When it was finally his turn to speak, James stood, his spine straight, his voice steady. "This isn't about a flagpole," he said, his voice carrying through the silent courtroom. "It never was. This is about control. This is about an organization that thought it could bully people into submission. They thought they could fine me into silence. When that didn't work, they sued me. When that didn't work, They tried to intimidate me. And when that didn't work, they ran. He turned to the jury, looking each one of them in the eyes. I served this country for 26 years. I lost friends who never got to come home. And when I came back, all I wanted was a quiet life, a place to honor those men, a flagpole to remind me of the sacrifices that were made so that we could live in a free country. And for that, they tried to destroy me. He held up the envelope, the anonymous package that had exposed the HOA's corruption. But I wasn't the only one, he continued. They've been doing this for years, targeting people who wouldn't fight back, forcing out long-term homeowners so they could sell their properties for a profit. They weren't enforcing community guidelines, they were running a business. And I was just the latest target in a long line of people they've cheated, harassed, and intimidated. Thomas stepped forward, placing a thick binder on the table. "Your Honor," he said, his voice sharp, "we have documented proof of the HOA's fraudulent activities, their selective enforcement, and their financial misconduct. We also have sworn statements from over a dozen homeowners who have been targeted, threatened, and pushed out of their homes under similar circumstances. We request that all claims against Mr. Calloway be dismissed immediately and that a formal investigation into the HOA be launched." The courtroom fell silent. The judge flipped through the binder, her expression unreadable. The HOA's attorneys shifted uncomfortably. They had come in expecting to crush James under legal fees and procedural loopholes, but now they were the ones on the defensive. After what felt like an eternity, the judge finally spoke. "The court finds that Mr. Calloway's right to free expression and property enjoyment was unjustly targeted," she said. "All claims against him are dismissed. Furthermore, based on the evidence presented, this court is recommending a full investigation into the HOA's activities, including financial misconduct and unlawful property seizures." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. James exhaled slowly, his grip on the table loosening. He had won. But just as he was about to sit down, a figure at the back of the courtroom stood up. A woman, elderly but dignified, her gray hair neatly pinned back. She clutched a small envelope in her hands, her eyes filled with something James couldn't quite place: pain, urgency. "Your Honor," she said, her voice trembling, "I have something to say." The judge nodded, motioning for her to come forward. The woman walked slowly to the witness stand, her hand shaking slightly as she opened the envelope. "My name is Margaret Holloway," she said. "My husband, Richard, was one of the homeowners forced out by the HOA. He passed away last year, believing he had lost everything. But before he died, he wrote this letter." She unfolded the paper, her voice breaking as she read. "If you're reading this, it means the fight isn't over. I wanted to stay. I fought to stay. But they broke me down. They took everything, not just our home, but our dignity. I hope one day someone stands up to them. I hope one day someone reminds them that people are worth more than profit." Tears welled in Margaret's eyes. "My husband thought he was alone, but he wasn't. And I don't want anyone else to feel that way." The weight of her words settled over the room. The battle had never just been about James. It had been about all of them. Every homeowner who had been driven out, every veteran who had been treated like a nuisance instead of a hero. Outside the courthouse, as reporters swarmed for statements, James stood beside Margaret, his hand steady on her shoulder. "You're not alone," he told her softly. "None of us are." The fallout from the case was swift. The state attorney's office announced a full investigation into the HOA's finances. Former board members turned on each other, revealing even deeper layers of corruption. Alan Greaves was finally tracked down, arrested on charges of fraud and embezzlement. And in the neighborhood itself, a movement began. Homeowners banded together, voting out the remaining HOA board members, and dismantling the corrupt structure from within. And as for James, he went home. He stood in his backyard, looking up at the flagpole, the same flagpole they had tried to take from him. And for the first time in a long time, he felt something settle in his chest. Not just victory, justice. And as the wind caught the stars and stripes, lifting them high into the sky, he knew that no matter how much people tried to bury the truth, it would always rise, just like that flag, and just like the people who fought for it.